"Who is that?" The Reverend Father's voice sliced through the quiet darkness. Anita's breath hitched, and her hands trembled. The cigarette burned slowly between her fingers, a symbol of her secret life catching up with her. Turning towards the familiar voice, her mind raced for an excuse, but deep down, she knew there was no escaping this time. Father Emmanuel stepped closer, his shadow tall and imposing under the dim streetlight. His brows furrowed as he recognized her. "Anita. My God, what are you doing here?" Anita's eyes darted around, searching for an answer, but her mouth refused to form words. She looked at the cigarette in her hand, the smudged makeup on her face, and the short dress that screamed everything she didn't want to admit. The silence between them was deafening. Father Emmanuel's gaze softened, though his disappointment lingered. "Come with me," he finally said, his voice quieter but firm. "We need to talk." Anita's story began long before this fateful night, back in her small village in eastern Nigeria. Born into the devout Okofor family, her life had always revolved around the church. Her father, Joseph Okofor, was a pillar of the Catholic community, known for his booming voice that led the congregation in prayer. Her mother, Amoka, was the heart of the Women's Fellowship, organizing charity events and ensuring the church's altar was always immaculate. From the moment Anita could walk, she was immersed in this world of faith. She was the kind of child who would skip games with her friends to sit quietly in the pews, watching the Reverend Father with wide-eyed admiration. Her earliest memories were of her father's voice echoing through the church during Sunday Mass and her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair as they prepared for service. "This child is destined for great things," people often said, watching her serve with a quiet diligence far beyond her years. And Anita believed them. She loved the church with all her heart. It wasn't just a building to her, it was home. As she grew older, Anita's love for God remained steadfast, but her dreams began to take a different shape. While her parents saw her as the perfect candidate for the sisterhood, Anita longed for a different life. She dreamed of a loving husband, children who would fill their home with laughter, and a simple, happy life where she could continue serving God alongside her family. It was a warm evening when Anita's future was decided for her. The family had gathered around the dinner table, the aroma of egusi soup and pounded yam filling the air. Anita had been quiet all evening, sensing the seriousness in her father's demeanor. "Anita," her father began, placing his spoon down carefully. "Your mother and I have been praying about your future. God has revealed to us that you are meant to serve Him in the highest way, as a reverend sister." The words hit Anita like a blow. She glanced at her mother, hoping for a different opinion, but Mama nodded with a small smile. "It is an honor, my dear. Not everyone is chosen for such a calling." "But, Papa," Anita began, her voice trembling. "I love God, but I've never thought about becoming a sister. I want to serve Him, yes, but..." Her father's gaze hardened. "This is not about what you want, Anita. It is about what God wants for you. And as your father, it is my duty to guide you." Tears welled up in her eyes. "What if I don't feel called to it? What if..." "Enough." Joseph's voice thundered. The room fell silent. "You will obey. This is final." Anita swallowed her protest, her heart heavy with a mix of anger and sadness. She felt trapped, unable to voice the dreams that danced in her mind, dreams of love, family, and a life outside the walls of the convent. The day Anita left for the convent was filled with prayers and blessings. Her mother packed her belongings with care, sleeping in a rosary that had been in the family for generations. "Remember," she said, hugging Anita tightly, "this is a privilege. God has chosen you." Anita nodded, though her heart felt like it was being torn apart. She watched her father load her small suitcase into the car, his face a mask of pride and determination. The journey to the convent was long, the scenery changing from the bustling streets of the village to the serene, quiet grounds of the Sacred Heart Convent. As they approached, Anita's stomach churned. The tall gates loomed ahead, and she felt like she was walking into a prison rather than a place of peace. At first, life in the convent was as peaceful as it seemed. The other sisters welcomed her warmly, showing her around the grounds and teaching her the daily routines. Anita threw herself into her duties, hoping to find solace in the work. She prayed, attended mass, and followed the strict schedules without complaint. But beneath the surface, Anita began to notice things that didn't sit right with her. There were whispers in the corridors, stifled giggles during evening prayers, and a certain air of secrecy among some of the sisters. Late at night, Anita would wake up to find empty beds, the soft creak of the door indicating someone had slipped out. When she asked about it in the morning, the answers were always vague. "I just needed some fresh air," one sister said with a smile. "I went to pray in the chapel," another claimed, though her smudged lipstick told a different story. Anita tried to ignore it. "Focus on your faith," she told herself. But the unease in her heart grew with each passing day. One evening, Anita noticed Sister Grace, one of the senior sisters, returning late with a new phone in her hand. Anita couldn't help but ask, "Where did you get that?" Sister Grace smiled, her eyes gleaming. "A gift," she said simply. Anita didn't press further, but her mind raced with questions. Where were they going? Who were they meeting? And why did it feel like she was the only one in the dark? As the days turned into weeks, Anita's curiosity became unbearable. She began to feel isolated, caught between her upbringing and the strange reality of the convent. The other sisters seemed so carefree, whispering about things she couldn't understand, while she clung desperately to the faith that had always guided her. Am I the only one who feels this way? She wondered. But deep down, she feared the truth. One night, unable to sleep, Anita decided to investigate. She waited until the others were asleep, then quietly followed the sound of footsteps outside her room. Her heart pounded as she crept through the dimly lit hallways, her bare feet silent on the cold stone floor. When she reached the door, she saw it, a group of sisters, dressed in casual clothes, slipping out into the night. Anita's breath caught in her throat as she watched them disappear into the darkness. For the first time, she felt a crack in the foundation of everything she had believed. What is really happening here? She thought, her heart heavy with dread. Anita lay awake that night, her mind racing with questions. The image of the sisters slipping out into the night haunted her, making sleep impossible. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of the wind, and the distant hum of a generator from the convent's chapel. Where are they going? She wondered. The sisters were meant to be the epitome of devotion, but something about their behavior didn't sit right with her. Their secretive nature, the sudden appearance of new phones, flashy jewelry, and expensive perfumes, it all felt wrong. Yet, Anita couldn't bring herself to confront them directly. She feared the answer might shatter the fragile faith she was clinging to. The next morning, Anita dragged herself out of bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. She went through the motions of the day, prayers, chores, and meals, but her mind was elsewhere. She watched the sisters closely, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that might explain their nighttime activities. Sister Grace, the one who always seemed to return with new trinkets, was laughing with a group of younger sisters during breakfast. Her laughter was light, carefree, as though she had no secrets to hide. Anita couldn't help but feel a pang of envy. How did they balance their double lives so easily? As the day wore on, Anita tried to shake off her unease. She told herself she was overthinking things. After all, these were women of God. Surely, they couldn't be doing anything wrong. Maybe I'm just imagining things, she thought. But the gnawing feeling in her chest refused to go away. That evening, as Anita was cleaning the chapel, she noticed something unusual. Tucked behind one of the pews was a small envelope. She picked it up, her curiosity piqued. The envelope was unmarked, but inside was a crisp bundle of naira notes. Anita's heart raced as she counted the money, several thousand naira, far more than any of the sisters should have had. Where did this come from, she wondered. Her hands trembled as she stuffed the envelope back where she found it. She didn't want to be caught with it. But the discovery only deepened her suspicion. Determined to find the truth, Anita decided to stay awake that night. She pretended to go to bed, waiting until the convent grew quiet. The clock ticked slowly, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, just past midnight, she heard it, the soft creak of footsteps in the hallway. Anita slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound. She peeked out of her room, her heart pounding in her chest. A group of sisters, dressed in jeans and t-shirts, was heading towards the back door of the convent. She recognized Sister Grace among them. Taking a deep breath, Anita followed at a distance. She felt like a child sneaking out of her parents' house, her every step filled with equal parts fear and excitement. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped outside, but she didn't stop. She kept to the shadows, trailing the group as they made their way down a narrow path that led to the main road. The sisters flagged down a passing taxi, laughing and chatting as they climbed in. Anita watched them drive off, her mind spinning. Where are they going? She thought. She considered going back to the convent, but her curiosity got the better of her. She hailed another taxi and told the driver to follow them. The taxi pulled up outside a nightclub in the heart of the city. The building was loud and vibrant, with neon lights casting colorful reflections on the pavement. Anita watched in disbelief as the sisters entered the club, their modest appearances completely transformed. They looked like ordinary young women out for a night of fun, not reverend sisters. Anita's hands shook as she paid the driver. She hesitated outside the club, unsure whether to go in. Her mind screamed at her to turn back, but her feet carried her forward. She needed to see for herself. The bouncer barely glanced at her as she entered, the pulsing music engulfing her senses. The air was thick with the smell of alcohol and sweat. Anita's eyes scanned the room until she spotted them. The sisters were mingling with men, laughing, drinking, and dancing. Her stomach churned. This was more than she had imagined. It wasn't just about gifts or money, they were living a completely different life outside the convent. Anita slipped out of the club before anyone could notice her. She walked down the street, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. The sight of the sisters enjoying themselves lingered in her mind. For the first time, she felt a twinge of jealousy. She thought about the envelope of money she had found in the chapel. The sisters seemed to have everything: freedom, wealth, and the kind of carefree life she had only dreamed of. Meanwhile, she was stuck in the convent, struggling to adapt to a life she hadn't chosen. That night, as she lay in bed, Anita couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. The idea of having a little extra money, of experiencing the freedom the other sisters had, began to creep into her mind. At first, she tried to push the thoughts away, but they kept coming back, louder and more tempting each time. Maybe I could just try it once, she thought. Just to see what it's like. The next time the sisters slipped out, Anita was ready. She dressed in the plainest clothes she had, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She followed them to the nightclub, her steps more confident this time. Inside, Sister Grace spotted her almost immediately. Her eyes widened in surprise, but then she smiled. Well, she said, pulling Anita into a hug. I didn't think you had it in you. Anita forced a smile, unsure of what to say. She let herself be pulled into their world, her senses overwhelmed by the lights, music, and energy of the club. It was nothing like the quiet life of the convent. For the first time in her life, Anita felt free. She danced, laughed, and even took a sip of the cocktail Sister Grace handed her. The night passed in a blur, and by the time she returned to the convent, the sun was beginning to rise. Over the next few weeks, Anita's life began to change. She joined the sisters on their nightly escapades, slipping out of the convent and into the city's nightlife. At first, she felt guilty, but the lure of wealth and freedom quickly overshadowed her shame. She began receiving gifts from the men she met: expensive perfumes, jewelry, and even a new phone. But as Anita's double life grew, so did the risk of exposure. She became more reckless, staying out later and venturing further from the convent. The line between her old life and her new one began to blur, and she couldn't tell which version of herself was real anymore. One morning, as Anita returned to the convent after a long night out, she noticed a figure standing by the gate. Her heart froze as she realized it was the Reverend Father. His eyes met hers, and the disappointment on his face was unmistakable. Anita, he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. What have you become? Anita stood frozen at the convent gate, her heart racing as the Reverend Father's gaze bore into her. The early morning light revealed her disheveled state, the smudged makeup, the wrinkled dress, and the faint scent of alcohol lingering on her clothes. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Father Emmanuel shook his head, his disappointment palpable. Come with me, he said quietly, turning towards his office. Anita hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. She wanted to run, to escape the shame burning in her chest, but there was no escaping now. She followed him silently, her steps heavy with dread. The walk to his office felt endless, and with each step, the weight of her actions pressed harder against her. Father Emmanuel closed the door behind them, the room eerily quiet. He motioned for Anita to sit, but she remained standing, unable to meet his eyes. He sighed deeply, rubbing his temples as if trying to find the right words. Anita, he began, his voice calm but firm. Do you know how much we trusted you? Your parents, the church, everyone believed you were destined for greatness. But look at you now. The words cut deep, and Anita felt tears sting her eyes. She tried to speak, to explain herself, but the shame was too overwhelming. Father Emmanuel leaned forward, his eyes searching hers. What happened to you? He asked. You were such a bright, kind soul. How did you end up here? Anita finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. I don't know, she admitted. It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Father Emmanuel sighed again, leaning back in his chair. Sin doesn't start with something big, Anita. It begins with small compromises, little choices that seem harmless at first. And before you know it, you're lost. The confrontation with Father Emmanuel replayed in Anita's mind for days, but it didn't stop her from returning to her double life. The allure of the nightlife, the gifts, and the attention were too strong to resist. Each time she stepped out of the convent, she told herself it would be the last. But it never was. Her friends, especially Sister Grace, encouraged her descent. You're finally leaving, Anita, Grace said one night as they got ready to leave for a club. This is what life is about, freedom, fun, and taking what you deserve. Anita wanted to believe her. For so long, she had felt trapped by her family's expectations, the weight of their dreams suffocating her. But now, she was free, or so she thought. As Anita became more comfortable with her double life, she started to attract attention, not just from the men she entertained but from people who knew her from the church. One Sunday, as she sat in the pews during Mass, she noticed a woman staring at her from across the aisle. The woman's eyes narrowed, and Anita's stomach churned. She recognized her. It was one of the parishioners who often attended morning Mass. After the service, the woman approached her. Anita, she said, her tone sharp. I saw someone who looked just like you last night, standing outside a club. But of course, it couldn't have been you. You're a reverend sister, after all. Anita forced a smile, her heart pounding. You must have mistaken me for someone else, she said quickly. I was here, at the convent. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. I see, she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. Well, I hope you stay on the right path. People are always watching, you know. Anita nodded, but the encounter left her rattled. The walls of her double life were beginning to close in, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One evening, Sister Grace introduced Anita to a wealthy businessman named Chike. He was older, with a commanding presence and a reputation for being generous with his money. Grace had spoken highly of him, describing him as a man who could change your life overnight. When Anita met him, she was immediately drawn to his confidence and charm. Chike took her out to dinner at an upscale restaurant, showering her with compliments and promises. You're too beautiful to be hidden away in a convent, he said, his voice smooth like honey. A woman like you deserves the best. For a moment, Anita allowed herself to imagine the life he was offering, a life of luxury and freedom, far from the confines of the convent. But deep down, a small voice reminded her of who she used to be, the girl who found joy in serving God and helping others. That voice grew fainter with each passing day, drowned out by the noise of her new life. One fateful night, Anita was standing outside a nightclub, smoking a cigarette and chatting with Sister Grace. She felt invincible, her fears and guilt buried under layers of denial. But as she exhaled a puff of smoke, a familiar figure appeared across the street. It was Father Emmanuel. Anita froze, the cigarette slipping from her fingers. Father Emmanuel's expression was a mix of shock, anger, and profound sadness. He crossed the street, his movements deliberate and slow. "Anita," he said, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. "So it's true?" She couldn't find the words to respond. The world around her seemed to blur as she stood there, exposed and vulnerable. Father Emmanuel didn't yell or reprimand her. Instead, he simply said, "Come back to the convent. We need to talk." Back in his office, Father Emmanuel's disappointment was more painful than any punishment. He didn't raise his voice or lecture her. Instead, he asked her one question: why? Anita broke down in tears, confessing everything, her struggles, her doubts, and the temptations that had led her astray. Father Emmanuel listened silently, his face unreadable. When she finished, he said, "You have a choice to make, Anita. You can continue down this path, or you can turn back to God. But know this, every choice has consequences." Anita nodded, her heart heavy with regret. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she had the strength to change. Anita was dismissed from the convent a week later, her actions too grave to be overlooked. As she packed her belongings, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost more than just her place in the convent, she had lost a part of herself. Standing outside the gates with her suitcase in hand, Anita looked back one last time. The towering walls of the convent seemed both oppressive and protective, a symbol of everything she had left behind. Anita stood outside the convent gates, her suitcase by her side, staring at the towering walls that had once been her shelter. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road. She had been dismissed, not just from the convent, but from the life she had once known. A wave of emptiness washed over her. Where would she go now? How would she explain this to her family? The thought of facing her parents filled her with dread. Her father's booming voice, her mother's quiet disappointment, it was too much to bear. Anita clutched her suitcase tightly, her feet rooted to the ground, unable to take the first step forward. Anita didn't go home right away. Instead, she wandered through the streets of the town, her mind clouded with guilt and confusion. The vibrant noise of the market filled the air, vendors shouting, children laughing, and the rhythmic clang of metal pots. These familiar sounds, once comforting, now felt distant and alien. She found herself sitting on a bench outside the local church, staring at the large crucifix above the entrance. The church had been her sanctuary as a child, a place where she had felt closest to God. Now, it was a painful reminder of everything she had lost. As she sat there, a group of children ran past, their laughter echoing in the air. One of them stopped and waved at her. "Auntie Anita," the boy called out, his face lighting up with recognition. Anita forced a smile, waving back, but her heart sank. The children had always looked up to her, seeing her as an example of kindness and faith. What would they think of her now if they knew the truth? When Anita finally returned home, the atmosphere was tense. Her parents sat in the living room, their faces a mix of confusion and worry. Her father, Joseph, was the first to speak. "What is the meaning of this, Anita?" he demanded. "Why are you back so soon? What happened?" Anita's hands trembled as she set her suitcase down. She avoided their gaze, staring at the floor. "I was dismissed," she said quietly. Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Dismissed? What do you mean? What did you do?" The room fell silent as Anita struggled to find the words. Finally, she said, "I made mistakes. Big mistakes. I wasn't the person you thought I was." Her father's face turned red with anger. "Do you know how much shame you've brought to this family? To this church? People trusted you, Anita. How could you throw it all away? Her mother began to cry softly, her disappointment evident. Anita wanted to defend herself, to explain the pressure she had felt and the temptations she had faced, but she knew it wouldn't make a difference. Her actions had hurt them deeply, and there was no undoing that. The days that followed were some of the hardest in Anita's life. She became the subject of whispers and gossip in the community. Wherever she went, she felt the weight of judgmental eyes following her. People who had once greeted her warmly now avoided her, their smiles replaced with cold indifference. But the worst part was the silence at home. Her father barely spoke to her, and her mother's kind words were replaced with curt replies. Anita felt like a stranger in her own home. Despite everything, Anita tried to find her way back to the faith that had once been her anchor. She began attending Mass again, sitting quietly in the back pews where she wouldn't be noticed. She prayed fervently, asking God for forgiveness and guidance. One afternoon, as Anita was leaving the church, she ran into Father Emmanuel. He greeted her warmly, his eyes kind despite everything that had happened. "Anita," he said, "it's good to see you here." She looked down, ashamed. "I don't know if I belong here anymore, Father," she admitted. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "The church is not just for the righteous, Anita. It's for everyone, especially those who are lost. God's mercy is infinite, but you have to open your heart to it." His words brought tears to her eyes. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe redemption was still possible, but it wouldn't come easily. Anita decided to confront the people she had wronged. She started with the Rev-sisters at the convent. Returning to the gates she had left weeks ago felt surreal. She was met with wary glances, but she bowed her head in humility, apologizing for her actions. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, her voice trembling. "But I needed to say I'm sorry." To her surprise, some of the sisters embraced her, while others remained distant. The experience was humbling, but it was a step forward. Next, she visited the local parishioners who had looked up to her. She volunteered to help clean the church and organize charity events, hoping to rebuild the trust she had lost. Slowly, people began to soften towards her, though the scars of her mistakes remained. Months passed, and Anita's life began to stabilize. She found solace in serving others, dedicating her time to the church's outreach programs. Though she still struggled with the weight of her past, she was determined to move forward. One Sunday, as she stood outside the church greeting parishioners, a young girl approached her. "Auntie Anita," the girl said shyly, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Anita knelt down, her eyes filling with tears. "Don't be like me," she said gently. "Be better. Always choose what's right, even when it's hard." The girl nodded, her face serious, and Anita realized that, despite everything, she still had the power to inspire others. Anita's journey was far from over, but she had learned an important lesson. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about making amends and striving to be better. Though she would always carry the weight of her mistakes, she chose to see them as reminders of God's grace and the strength it took to rise after a fall. Years later, Anita stood at the front of a small classroom, teaching a group of children about the love of God. Her life was simple, but it was filled with purpose. She no longer sought the approval of others or the fleeting pleasures of the world. Instead, she found joy in the little things, in the laughter of the children, the warmth of the sun, and the quiet moments of prayer. Anita's story became a cautionary tale in her community, but it was also a story of hope, a reminder that no matter how far one strays, the path back to God is always open.